Hello, I'm David Yaden, and this is Science of Spirituality on meaningoflife.tv, where we talk about scientific research on topics related to spirituality. And I'm here with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, Scientific Director of the Imagination Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. Really great to have you on, Scott. So Scott is a world-class researcher on the topics of creativity and intelligence, but has recently started thinking a lot about spirituality as it pertains to the theories of Abraham Maslow and some trait differences that seem related to spirituality as well. So, Scott, great to have you on and to continue our conversations. We're actually about 50 feet apart from each other in different offices in the positive psych.
I could come running over right now and surprise you.
Right. Yeah, you may even hear some feedback with the audio leaking under the doors.
Yeah.
Um,
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me on, David. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So Scott, tell me a little bit about your interest in Abraham Maslow. I know you've been reading his journals voraciously recently. What compelled you to investigate his work?
Well, I think, I teach a course, Introduction to Positive Psychology at Penn for the undergrads, and I really wanted to dive into the history of positive psychology, and I really wanted to get it right to teach the students. And when I was diving into that history, I discovered the humanistic psychologists and their ideas. So not just Maslow, but there's a whole group of them, right? So Carl Rogers and Erich Fromm and Rollo May, and I just resonated with their way of thinking about existence, the nature of human existence, and it was just so profound to me. It just really spoke to some sort of deep part of my soul, and in a way that a lot of positive psychology didn't speak to, quite honestly. The notion of happiness never really rang. Never really interested me as much as the concepts that the humanistic psychologists were talking about. So then I forget how I stumbled upon his unpublished journals, but I bought the 2-volume set because I thought it'd be really cool to see if there's anything I can glean from that. Basically I read all his writings before I got his journals. I was like, did I miss anything? And I was hooked. By the third day of his journal, I was like, wow, I'm going to devote the next 6 months of my life, or however long this takes, to read all 1,000 pages. And I went through them all. Every single page of the 2-volume set, and realized that he was working on a theory before he passed away. He was really there was something that wasn't fully formed, but it was there and it was meaningful, and it really spoke to me. Whatever he was grasping there at the end of his life, which was cut tragically short. I think he was just 61 years old.
Sure.
Yeah.
A departure from you, right? Because your work has been really quantitatively oriented. You kind of approach these difficult topics like intelligence and creativity, things that are hard to define and pin down. But a lot of your career has been doing just that and advancing the measurement of these topics. So did you feel like you sort of needed a break and wanted to investigate more of almost the more humanities side of the field of psychology as opposed to the more quantitative measurement side?
Well, I think that, and I don't expect you to have done this because that would be creepy if you did, but if you actually followed all of my writings over the last 10 years, and you will even look at my old Psychology Today blog, you would see that the themes that most interested me over and over again and which I did most of my research on in the last 10 years, were things that like schizotypy, like openness to experiences, um, uh, sort of creativity, but creativity is a way of being. Creativity is a way of actually transcending yourself in a lot of ways. So I think like it was something. I think is how this works in life. Is we have, we're always in this process of putting our vibrations out in the universe and getting closer and closer to understanding what resonates, what frequency we really want to fully dial into. And I think I've undergone a lot of personal growth in the past couple of years. Probably, I mean, the last 10 years, I mean, incredible growth in the sense of really narrowing what really speaks to me. And it was cool to discover these writings of the human. Like when I discovered the writings of Robert Sternberg on intelligence in grad school, or not in grad school, when I was an undergraduate, I was like, wow, this new way, broadened way of thinking about intelligence as creativity, as getting in touch with your intuition, practical intelligence, made me do my whole dissertation on why intuition is an important part of intelligence that we're missing out on. I mean, that was my theory of intelligence, was that we're missing out on the experiential realm of being. But that's exactly that. I mean, what my dissertation was, my theory of intelligence that I published in 2009. My is called the dual process theory of intelligence. That's the name of my PhD thesis. Is exactly what Carl Rogers talked about. You know what I mean? So it's like when I read Carl Rogers, I was like, what? First of all, I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I read Carl Rogers when I was in grad school. I wouldn't have had to write a dissertation. but no, I'm joking. But do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
A lot of your earlier work is really circling this topic of ways to get beyond your ordinary sense of self in various ways. And so you see yourself some kind of circling this topic of different modes of spirituality, perhaps, different ways of thinking about it.
Different states of consciousness. I mean, that's a really big theme in my writings for the past 10 years. Like, I wrote a lot, I was fascinated. I wrote this article that did, like maybe 7 years ago, I wrote this about, I was fascinated between the link between schizotypy and the flow experience. And I wrote a bunch of articles on that link.
I need to read that.
I'd love to, hey, I'd love to send it to you. And I remember, just becoming so fascinated with that link that I didn't think a lot of people knew of. Like what I liked about it was the juxtaposition of like combining what we call mental illness, or maybe a personality dimension. It's not a mental illness. Schizotypy is just a personality dimension we all differ on, but which people have linked to schizophrenia, and showing that it was linked. And by the way, this is before I even got interested in positive psychology. So I was fascinated that like something like that could be linked to flow state of consciousness, which is people talk about in uniformly positive terms.
Right.
So I was just like, that's so cool, like just was so cool to me. And also my interest in intelligence and different kinds of minds, like autism and kids with different learning disabilities and stuff as well. Really is so interesting to me, how they can have certain strengths that we see as weaknesses.
Right. That's fascinating. I should say, full disclosure to those listening, Scott and I work on a lot of different ongoing empirical projects, and it's, so a lot of times when we meet and talk, we're talking about nuts and bolts kinds of things now. So it's really great to talk about
this is fun.
Journey and this more speculative high level stuff. But I've never heard you characterize your work as really focused on mental states, which is a really fascinating way of thinking about it, or maybe you said altered states even.
Yeah, altered states of consciousness. It's so interesting because that's what, there's so much of focus in school and on a certain way of being, right? A certain standardized test is like assuming that like that's, that we have standardized minds. And I just think that it's so interesting to study people people's being, on their own terms, like whatever, I guess, if it's autism, if it's, whatever it is, and kind of like just understanding, what the potential benefits of that are. And I also really just I didn't like the stigmatization of, I've been interested in schizophrenia, for a while, there's family history of it, for instance, stuff like that. This interview is, I'm just saying stuff I've never said before. Just I'm just very, very interested um, uh, in things that we pathologize, right? Things that we automatically say, well, those states of consciousness are, put them in the DSM, put them in the DSM.
To pathologize.
Yes, but what could be the potential benefits of that state of consciousness? And that question, I mean, that was a big theme of my PhD dissertation, was like saying, like, are there these experiential forms of intelligence that are, and do we want to call them as forms of intelligence? And I argued in this 2-volume dissertation, that that's the right. I'm going to save you from having to read 2-volume dissertation. But yes, I argue, yes, they're important. They're just as important as rationality, by the way. That was the argument. What I mean is, they're just, if not more, when it comes to creativity, I wanted to argue it's even more important than the rational mode of thought. Do you
Characterize these as this sort of broad category of altered states or mental states, and it occurs to me that there's not great definitions for what a mental state or an altered state is.
Yeah.
And it almost makes me think about the state of emotion psychology or affective neuroscience back 20 years ago, when psychologists and neuroscientists were wondering whether emotions were too fleeting and too vague to ever really be the topic of good research. And now we might be at a time where mental states or altered states, which of course people like Maslow and William James and so many others have talked about.
Maslow was deeply influenced by James.
Can actually measure these things, in the same sort of way that now psychologists and neuroscientists don't think twice about being able to measure emotions.
Right. Well, man, that would, I mean, that's why there needs to be a new field, like transcendence, like that. There needs to be a new field of psychology that like appreciates that just as much as like effective neuroscience is well accepted, right? No one especially, actually, you could put any word before neuroscience and it'll become instantly accepted, right?
But right now, if you said mental state neuroscience or altered state neuroscience, it's sort of right on the border, of respectability.
That's a good point. Good.
These technological advances seem like they're incredibly important in order to study different states of mind, the physiological aspects.
I couldn't agree more. I wrote an article, I think it was called Must One Risk Madness to Achieve Genius? And I argued in there, that creativity involves, this is why I'm so one of the reasons why I'm so interested in creativity, because I really do believe it requires an altered state of consciousness. So in this article, I reviewed the latest biological research, on the brain states of creative people, as well as just like the dopamine production of creative people. We should talk about dopamine in a second as well, because I think it's so relevant to both of our interests. But I argue, but all the research seems to converge on the idea that in order to be creative, you must risk madness. Like you must be able to be willing or open to go there, but also have the capacity to return to reality. So that's what's the difference between someone we put in a mental institution versus someone who makes the encyclopedia.
And just to be clear, going there to you is you mean an altered state?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to go, and you see that in the brain. You see the brain networks. You see so clearly that people who are come up with really creative ideas in the fMRI machine, they are more likely to resemble brain states of dreaming People who are dreaming, people who even if you just follow them all throughout the day, they on average tend to have and the way it's phrased in the literature is an inability or difficulty suppressing activity in their imagination brain network. Well, I don't. It's all framing issue, right? What do you mean difficulty suppressing? It's like lighten up, you stuffy neuroscientist. What that research to me is suggesting is that these people aren't scared of embracing their like fantasy and things that might not be in touch with reality. They're brave. To me, that's being brave. That's not. Do you know what I mean? And I just think, yeah.
Thing is the way that you're talking right now about creativity is the way that so many spiritual teachers talk doing something like enlightenment. That there's this risk of madness and that there's walking the razor's edge between sort of conventionality and madness in order to reach enlightenment. You hear this kind of rhetoric coming out of mystical traditions, and mystical traditions seem to be mostly defined by this readiness to enter into these altered states. And so the way that you're talking about creative experiences sounds very similar to spiritual experiences, even down to the brain science that you mentioned. I usually go off of the neurological model that Andrew Newberg talks about, but there's another one by Kevin Nelson, who wrote a book called The Spiritual Doorway of the Brain, and his model.
You keep increasing my reading list, David. I'm not gonna get any papers done.
These things on the.
Will you send this to me? Okay.
It's about the REM switch, and that people who he surveyed a bunch of people who were near death. It's probably a cardiac care unit or something, and he found that those who reported spiritual experiences, near-death experiences, when they were near death, had a REM switch that was a little leaky, so to speak, that they were having more REM episodes through normal everyday life, which sounds very similar to what you're talking about in terms of creativity and the imagination network or the default mode network. So
there's great
resonance between creative and spiritual.
There totally is, and I'm really glad that you brought up that connection, because create the act of creating, I think, is a spiritual experience. Yeah, right.
Tell me more about that. My fiance always talks about creative and spiritual states being similar, but I always find myself trying to define them differently. But there does seem to be this resonance as well. So how do you see those two things as overlapping?
It's interesting, because I wish I had a really perfectly prepared succinct answer to that, but then again, if I did, I feel like I'd be disappointed, because that I want more to learn and explore, right? So I'm glad I don't have an answer to that right away. But I think to answer that question, you actually have to define what spirituality is.
Yeah.
Let's define. How about I define what creativity is, and you define what spirituality is, and then maybe that'll help us answer this. So creativity is acts of originality and meaningfulness in daily life. That's how I define creativity. But I also sometimes define creativity more simply as putting in just any act of putting into existence, putting to being something that has never existed before. That's a more mundane definition, but that's actually how Rollo May defined it in his book, The Courage to Create. And I like that definition actually a lot, because then because I really like to view creativity as a way of being, not as like people think of creativity, you have to be Mozart to be creative. I like to think of creativity as a way of relating to your universe.
Right.
So, given all that, how would you define spirituality?
Yeah, so I had Crystal Park on here, and we went through we tried to get to a definition of spirituality. It's really tough to do. One definition that a lot of people talk about comes out of a Fetzer conference, where like 80 scientists came together to try to put together a definition of spirituality. And I think they really took the definition that Ken Pargament, who's a psychologist, offered, which is spirituality is a search for the sacred.
Yeah, and then what does sacred mean? Yeah.
It really just passes the definitional buck.
It does.
Sacred. And so I'm willing to be a little bit more specific, with the important caveat that I think spirituality is definitely multidimensional. You have things like practices, rituals, affiliations, institutions, scripture, experiences, beliefs. Like, all of these things are different dimensions of spirituality, I think.
Is it also multidimensional in terms of like physics, like like the spiritual realm versus the
Belief, I think, but I think that you have a lot of, you have people like Sam Harris and Barbara Ehrenreich who are atheists, but who have different spiritual practices,
yeah,
and so are in some sense spiritual. But I think the belief, in terms of the belief, like what is a spiritual belief, I think I'm willing to say that a belief counts as spiritual if it involves or entails some notion of non-physical mind. So if you're willing to say that mind can exist like outside of a body, whether it's in a specific sort of entity like an angel, or all-pervading consciousness, sort of imbuing reality or somehow beyond it, all of those beliefs seem to me spiritual. And if you hold that belief, or you're involved in something that involves maybe that experience, that to me somehow seems spiritual. So involving non-physical mind is where I'm going to land on that, but there's problems with it.
So I thank you, by the way, for doing that on the spot. I wonder. I think there really is something to this, and we should try to unpack this, because this gets to the heart of the Venn diagram intersection of both of us. Is like, I do think that the creative act is a spiritual act. I really do believe that, and I believe that the feeling that creative people have, I mean, not like during the process, a lot of it is painful, painful, but there is a point upon which you create something that has meaning to the larger universe, and you release it, like that moment of releasing it to the world, and it's outside of yourself. That feeling is described by creative people as a spiritual experience, and I personally feel it, and I think a lot of people listening can resonate with that feeling. So it's not the only thing that brings the spiritual experience, and you, right behind you, you have all these diagrams and everything. You study a lot of other things that bring, but I do think creativity is like deserves a place at that of your table at the back. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and feeling connected to something beyond and larger than oneself is sometimes how people think about spirituality, or transcendence, and that seems related to creativity, in the sense that they're both going beyond one's ordinary sense of self. When with creativity, maybe you're putting part of yourself out there, and with spirituality, you're connecting to something larger out there. I don't know if that does it, but there's definitely some resonance between those two topics. But let's talk about a difference. There seems like spirituality has a moral dimension or valence that creativity doesn't necessarily have. When you think of someone who's spiritual, usually you think of them as
benevolent,
as wanting to be a good person or a good person, whereas you think of a creative person, that's not necessarily part of the connotation.
Well, this is where things get interesting. So my poster sort of moment of my dissertation was when I discovered this 4-factor model of intellect, and one of the factors was a factor that had previously not been discovered in the literature, and that was this factor of affective I called it effective engagement, but it's your total openness to the totality of your emotional experience, whether it's good and bad, all the shades in between. And I found that was the only factor of the four that was actually a hybrid between compassion and openness to experience. I think that that intersection of compassion and openness to experience is spirituality, and I think creativity doesn't require it requires openness to experience, but doesn't necessarily require compassion. So that yeah.
And so part of the work that you and I have been doing might be relevant here, looking at the light triad and the dark.
Yay! I was waiting for that term to be mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. So, so you've done some really interesting work on the dark triad, right?
Yeah,
You've written something.
very interesting that too. The thing is, with my openness to experience, the problem is, like I'm not very gritty by like Andrew Duckworth's definition because I am just ravenously curious.
Uh-huh. And grit being the persistence of interest over a long period.
Consistency, yeah, consistency of in. I'm consistent in my interests, but of maybe 10 things. Like I can actually list 10 things that I've been really consistently interested in. Do you know what I mean? I'm ravenously curious. So I've been also very interested in I wrote a cover story for Psychology Today called How to Spot a Narcissist, which is one of the like best selling, Psychology Today magazines because everyone wants to know, how do you spot a narcissist? That's what we've been finding.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
So action. Okay. So the dark triad is not clinical. So it's not a mental illness, and it's not diagnosable as a personality disorder. So it's subclinical, but it's an aversive personality style.
yeah,
And there's three components of it. There's narcissism, there's Machiavellianism, and there's psychopathy.
correct.
And they're related to sort of maybe sometimes criminal behavior, right? But also just well, you tell me.
Yeah, the motive for short-term outcomes, for opportunistic sort of behaviors like short-term sexual mating opportunities, power, money, social status is a big one. A lot of these, a drive for a lot of these ancestral rewards.
Okay, so short-term strategies, so sort of emphasis on fame, money, power at all.
Exploitation of the environment.
And it seems like someone who's spiritual. That seems sort of antithetical to
Right.
being dark triad. Yes, yet we all know creatives who have these
Ah,
qualities. So there might be something there. Um, and so you and I have talked about the light triad, and we're starting work on this. So the flip side of the dark triad is the light triad, and instead of narcissism, we have transcendence. Instead of psychopathy, we have humanism, and instead of Machiavellianism, we have categorical imperativism.
these are just what we're labeling these things now. We working. It's all work in progress. That's right.
These are sort of the things that mark everyday saints, and saints is obviously a very religious or spiritual sort of term.
Right.
So there seems to be some kind of resonance that these qualities are what spiritual people aim to be and what spiritual communities aim to foster, at least on some level.
Right.
I wonder how successful they are. Does spirituality help, or is it just sort of a veneer
How successful they are in terms of what?
in fostering these light triad traits in people?
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. And atheists would be very interested in that question as well. A scientific study on how it does. So there's so many avenues of future research that I hope that this spawns. It'll be very interesting to look at the development of these traits. It'll be very interesting to look at is the absence of the dark triad automatically the presence of the light triad characteristics. What can we do to take people from who are just like kind of like neutral, not like they're not like constantly opportunistic, but they're not particularly interested in others that much. How can we move that needle from 0 to 5?
So you're taking the Michael Bame's mindfulness-based stress reduction course at Penn,
Yes. Yes.
which is kind of a second
Yes.
sort of group to some extent.
Yes.
And so, what do you see in terms? So you're meditating for 20 or 40 minutes a day.
Yes.
Do you feel yourself becoming more saintly?
Yes. More spiritual, for sure. I don't know if I can get any more saintly. I'm joking. I'm joking. That would be a narcissistic thing to say. Um, no, I mean, I've definitely noticed my mind becoming clearer, and I can observe lots of patterns that are helpful in growing as a person, and be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I don't think I want to entertain those thoughts anymore.
So Robert Wright, in his book on Buddhism, talks about meditation as a way to see reality more clearly.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's what you're experiencing to some extent.
People say that a lot, like the idea that meditation is all about seeing reality more clearly. It's interesting because, like Eric Fromm and in terms of Maslow, his defining definition of his self-actualizing people was they see reality more clearly. That's what he said in his book. Yeah, that is what a self-actualizing person is someone who sees reality more clearly. That's like the central defining feature. Isn't that interesting? And then,
Like you could just as much make an argument that there's a lot of positive illusions going on with a self-actualized person.
but all these other principles stem off from that idea of self-actualizing people. And then Eric Fromm, there's this great creativity and its cultivation edited volume that like not many people have read today, but of all the great humanistic psychologists talking about their theories of creativity. And Eric Fromm argues creativity is the ability to see reality clearly, to constantly see things as they are. He said that like seeing things as they are is actually what leads to insights. And what leads to connecting dots that other people don't see, which is what creativity is. So I think a lot of people are saying the same thing, I guess is the point I'm trying to say. And I mean, this is Robert Wright's channel, and I like Robert Wright. I also want to make clear that, that he said a lot of unique things in that book that he wrote. But I think that what's exciting is that a lot of people are converging on this similar idea that in order to have optimal creativity, in order to really have deep, meaningful, and original insights about yourself and the world, you actually do have to silence all the noise.
Yeah, that was really beautifully put. I think we should probably end there.
Sounds good to me.
As this notion of mindfulness as a potentially connecting link between creativity and spirituality.
I love it. I really love it.
But thanks so much, Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, for coming on and talking to us. I hope to have you on again sometime in the not too distant future.
Thanks, David. It's been a privilege working with you.
Likewise. Talk to you soon.
Come over to my office. Bye.